Right, looks like another pretty intense week in global affairs. You've sent over a ton of info on Ukraine, obviously, but also Syria, the Middle East in general, even some big stuff happening in Korea.
Yeah, it's been a pretty wild week, that's for sure. A lot of moving pieces out there.
So let's do what we do best. Take a deep dive into these sources, figure out what really matters in all of this, and maybe even uncover some surprises along the way.
Sounds good to me. Fire away.
Well, first off, Ukraine. Things are getting, well, kind of scary over there. Some of these sources are suggesting that Russia is gaining serious ground, getting dangerously close to some key cities. Pokrovsk is one they keep mentioning.
Yeah, the speed of these Russian advances is what's really striking. We haven't seen them move this quickly since the initial invasion back in 2022. Seems like they've shifted gears, focusing on cutting off those Ukrainian supply lines.
Makes sense. Cripple the logistics and the whole war effort can grind to a halt.
Exactly. And these sources mention some pretty elite Russian units. They call them Grot units. Apparently, they're operating deep behind enemy lines, disrupting communications, sabotaging logistics. Real nasty stuff.
I bet. Not exactly what you want to deal with when you're already fighting for your survival.
I'm kidding.
Yeah.
And then you've got the whole issue of those U.S.-supplied ATCMS missiles. Ukraine's been using them to hit targets inside Russia, which, Trump's calling crazy.
And even Putin's praising Trump for it, right?
Yeah, it's a bizarre situation. Definitely raises some questions about how the U.S. stance on the conflict might change once Trump takes office. And how will Russia respond to these attacks on their own soil?
Yeah, that's a big question mark. And then there's that whole other thing, that new Russian hypersonic missile they keep mentioning.
Right. Not exactly something you want to see flying around if you're on the receiving end.
Definitely not. And on top of all that, there are reports of heavy Ukrainian casualties, potential shortages of soldiers, delays in Western arms deliveries. Their average soldier now is something like 45 years old. Doesn't paint a very optimistic picture, does it?
No, not at all. And there's even talk about the U.S. suggesting Ukraine lower their draft age to 18 to try and boost recruitment. But Zelensky's pushing back against that, obviously.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners?
Well, the conflict is far from over, and the stakes just keep getting higher. The next few weeks could be absolutely decisive. This could have a ripple effect on everything: energy prices, global security, even the balance of power in Europe.
Yeah, it's a whole lot bigger than just what happens on the battlefield, doesn't it?
Absolutely. What happens in Ukraine has the potential to impact all of us.
Speaking of global power shifts, let's move on to Syria. The sources you sent on this are fascinating. The fall of the Assad regime. It seems like the rebel group HTS just swept in and took over almost overnight.
It is pretty remarkable how quickly it all happened. But what's even more interesting is the level of strategic planning involved. The HTS, they weren't just some ragtag group of fighters. They clearly analyzed their enemy, built their own weapons, even developed a pretty sophisticated drone program.
Yeah, that's impressive.
Yeah, it kind of shows how a seemingly weaker force can overcome a more powerful one through sheer strategic thinking and innovation.
So Assad's gone, the HTS is in control. What happens next?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Blinken's already heading to the region. Turkey's maneuvering for influence. It's a whole new ball game.
The Syrian conflict has always been this tangled web of competing interests, and now it just got even more complicated.
Absolutely. The U.S. is worried about the resurgence of ISIS. Turkey has its own ambitions in the region. And then there's the risk of further destabilization and humanitarian crises.
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack. And we're not even done yet. Over in Korea, we've got a major political earthquake.
Yeah.
President Yoon Suk-yeol just got impeached.
Yeah, talk about a sudden turn of events.
What happened there?
Well, he was accused of trying to impose martial law to hold on to power, which is pretty concerning. It raises some serious questions about the future of democracy in Korea.
Yeah, some of these sources are even comparing this to Park Geun-hye's impeachment back in 2017. It seems like Korean politics is anything but predictable these days.
It does, doesn't it? This whole situation really highlights the importance of checks and balances, of a free press, of an engaged citizenry. When those things are weakened, democracy is at risk.
And that's a lesson that applies far beyond Korea's borders, I'd say.
Absolutely. It's something we all need to be mindful of.
All right, last but not least, we got to talk about the Middle East. Always a lot going on there, it seems.
You said it.
This time, you've got sources suggesting that Hamas and Israel are, get this, edging closer to a ceasefire. But then, on the other hand, there are concerns about Iran's growing influence and their espionage activities. What's the real story here?
Honestly, it's probably a bit of both. The Middle East is rarely straightforward.
True that.
You've got these ongoing tensions between Israel and Hamas, the proxy war between Iran and Israel, and now with the HTS potentially emerging as a major player in Syria, the whole dynamic is shifting again.
And of course, there's always the nuclear question looming in the background. Trump's past statements about Iran, they're not exactly reassuring.
Nope, definitely not. The potential for a nuclear arms race in the region is a very real concern. Any misstep could have catastrophic consequences, not just for the Middle East, but for the whole world.
So much to think about.
That's just the tip of the iceberg, I'm afraid.
Well, before we go any deeper, let's take a quick break and then we'll come back to dig into some of these issues in more detail.
Sounds like a plan.
We'll be right back after this short break.
So where were we?
We were about to take a deeper look at some of the issues we just touched on, starting with that potential ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Seems like there's actually some progress there.
Yeah, it's surprising considering, well, everything. But some of these sources suggest that Hamas has actually dropped their demand for a complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza.
That's a big deal. That's been a non-starter for, forever, right?
Pretty much. And they've also agreed to hand over a list of living hostages they're holding in Gaza, which could open the door to a prisoner exchange.
Interesting. So what's Israel offering in return?
The deal on the table right now is a 60-day ceasefire, during which time they would carry out the prisoner exchange. Gives everyone a bit of breathing room, maybe a chance to actually talk.
Okay, so let's say best case scenario, they actually get this ceasefire in place. What happens then? I mean, the root causes of the conflict, they don't just disappear overnight, right?
Exactly. That's the challenge, isn't it? The ceasefire is just a first step. What's really needed is a genuine peace process that addresses those underlying issues.
So what would that even look like? Where do you even start with something as complex as this?
Well, first and foremost, you need both sides to come to the table in good faith, willing to compromise, willing to make tough decisions.
And that's never been easy with this conflict.
Not at all. And you'd also need serious involvement from the international community. Countries like the U.S., Egypt, acting as mediators, helping to build trust, keep things on track.
Sounds like a tall order.
It is. But hey, there have been times when peace seemed possible, right? The problem is someone always backs out. Someone's not willing to go that extra mile.
So you're saying for this to work, both sides have to be all in.
Exactly. They need to recognize that the status quo, the way things are now, it's not working. It's just this endless cycle of violence that benefits no one.
Yeah, that's for sure. What about Jerusalem, though? That always seems to be the biggest sticking point.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Jerusalem is a holy city for both Jews and Muslims. Its status is so sensitive, so emotionally charged, it's hard to even imagine a solution that would work for everyone.
So what you're saying is it's complicated.
To put it mildly.
Well, let's hope they can at least get this ceasefire going. Any progress towards peace is better than none, right?
Absolutely. It's something to build on, at least.
Okay, moving on. We got to talk about the Trump administration and how their return to the White House might shake things up globally.
I mean, he's not exactly known for his predictability, is he?
You said it. His foreign policy is a bit of a mystery, to be honest. He's made contradictory statements in the past, so it's hard to say exactly what approach he'll take.
Yeah, trying to predict what Trump's going to do is a fool's errand, I think.
Probably right. But one thing's for sure. He loves to disrupt things. He's a master at shaking up the status quo.
So how do you think that's going to play out in some of these specific situations? Let's start with Ukraine. What do you think Trump's going to do there?
Well, he's already been pretty vocal about criticizing the Biden administration's support for Ukraine, saying it's just prolonging the war. He's even hinted that he might be open to negotiating directly with Putin to try and end it. Isn't that risky, though? I mean, Putin's shown no willingness to back down, and any deal Trump makes could end up looking like he's just caving to Russia.
That's definitely a valid concern. Trump's approach to Russia is, well, unpredictable. There's no guarantee he could stand up to Putin, actually defend U.S. interests.
And what about Iran? He was pretty hawkish on them during his first term, ripped up the nuclear deal, slapped on all those sanctions.
Yeah, that was a whole thing. And honestly, who knows if he'd even try to re-engage on the nuclear issue. Some people think he might try for a new deal, but others say he'll probably just double down on the pressure campaign.
More sanctions, more threats, more of the same, basically.
Possibly. And then there's the whole broader Middle East situation. Will he be as pro-Israel as he was before? Or will he try for a more, balanced approach?
Yeah, he's made pro-Palestinian statements in the past, too, hasn't he?
He has. So, yeah, it's a big question mark.
So basically, we're stepping into a giant unknown when it comes to U.S. foreign policy.
Pretty much. It's a time for Cautious optimism, maybe.
Cautious, definitely. Optimism, we'll see. But let's not forget about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. That's not going away anytime soon.
No, definitely not. The situation is still incredibly tense. Both sides are dug in, and the fighting's not letting up.
These sources mention some pretty heavy fighting around Pokrovsk. That seems to be a key target for the Russians.
Yeah, if they manage to take Pokrovsk, it would give them control of a major rail hub, which would really hurt Ukraine's ability to resupply their troops in the east.
And on top of that, the Ukrainians are dealing with heavy casualties, they're running low on ammo, and the Western military aid is getting delayed. Doesn't sound good.
No, it doesn't. And it's getting colder, too. Winter's setting in, and that's always an advantage for the defender. But it also makes life on the front lines even tougher.
Brutal. And then there's the whole nuclear thing. Russia keeps making those vague threats about using nukes if they feel threatened.
Yeah, most analysts think they're just trying to scare everyone, but, you never really know with these things.
It's a chilling thought, to be honest. The stakes in this conflict are just getting higher and higher.
No doubt about it. And with Trump back in the picture, who knows what that means for the future of the conflict?
Yeah, that's a whole other layer of complexity, isn't it? But before we get too bogged down in doom and gloom, let's talk about a story that's actually kind of inspiring. The HTS in Syria, they managed to pull off a pretty impressive victory against Assad. Their leader, Abu Hura al-Hawi, seems like a pretty fascinating figure.
Yeah, he's a smart guy, that's for sure. A real strategist. He managed to unite all those different rebel factions, something no one thought was possible, and he took on Assad and won.
Like a real-life David and Goliath story.
Exactly. But now comes the hard part. Actually governing a country that's been shattered by war.
Yeah, that's not going to be easy.
Not at all. He's got to consolidate power, rebuild the country, and somehow keep all those different factions happy. And he's got to do it all while the U.S., Turkey, Russia, and everyone else is breathing down his neck.
Man, that's a tough job.
You bet it is.
Okay, speaking of tough jobs, let's talk about South Korea. Things just got even more interesting there.
How so?
The Constitutional Court just upheld President Yoon's impeachment, which means he is officially out of office.
Wow, that's a huge development. So much for clinging to power, huh?
Yeah, looks like his little power grab backfired spectacularly.
It's a win for democracy, though, isn't it? Shows that even powerful people can be held accountable.
Absolutely. And now they've got 60 days to elect a new president. Should be an interesting race.
Definitely. Who do you think's going to come out on top?
No idea. Too early to tell. But it'll be fascinating to see how this all plays out. And don't forget about North Korea. They've been awfully quiet lately, which always makes me nervous.
Yeah, they're the ultimate wild card, aren't they? They could easily try to take advantage of all this instability in the South.
It wouldn't be the first time.
Right.
All right, let's take a step back for a second and look at the big picture. It feels like the world is going through a major transition right now. So much uncertainty, so much volatility. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around it all.
Yeah, it's overwhelming, isn't it? So much is happening at once, it's hard to keep up.
Exactly. But that's what we're here for, right? To try to make sense of it all.
That's the goal, at least.
So let's start with the big one, China. They're on the rise, no doubt about it. Economically, militarily, they're challenging the U.S. in every way.
Yeah, they're playing the long game. They've got a clear vision, a clear strategy, and they're executing it flawlessly.
And what's the end goal? World domination.
Not necessarily, but they definitely want to be the world's leading power. They want to reshape the global order to be more favorable to their interests.
And that's a problem for the U.S., obviously.
Definitely. The U.S. has been the dominant power for decades, and they're not going to give that up easily.
So we're headed for a showdown then, a new Cold War.
It's certainly a possibility, but it doesn't have to be that way. The U.S. and China can find ways to cooperate, to compete peacefully, to manage their differences.
Sounds easier said than done.
It is, but it's not impossible. It's going to require a lot of diplomacy, a lot of patience, and a lot of understanding.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they be paying attention to in this U.S.-China rivalry?
Well, first of all, they should recognize that this is a long-term game. It's not going to be resolved overnight. And they should pay attention to how each side is trying to build their influence economically, militarily, diplomatically. It's a global chess match, basically.
Right. And who do you think's winning right now?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Honestly, it's too early to say. Both sides have their strengths and weaknesses.
It's going to be a wild ride, that's for sure.
Hold on tight, folks.
Okay, let's switch gears for a moment and talk about the global economy. It's been taking a beating lately, hasn't it?
Yeah, between the war in Ukraine, The energy crisis, inflation, and all the other fun stuff. It's been a rough year for the global economy.
What's the outlook? Are we headed for a recession?
Honestly, it's hard to say for sure. There are a lot of factors at play, but it's definitely not looking good.
And what about the average person? What can they do to protect themselves in this kind of economic uncertainty?
Well, first of all, don't panic. It's important to stay calm and make rational decisions. And it's always a good idea to have a financial cushion, some savings set aside for a rainy day.
Makes sense.
And if you're invested in the stock market, maybe consider diversifying your portfolio. Spreading your risk a little bit.
Solid advice. Okay, let's talk about something a little more, uplifting.
Uplifting in this news cycle.
Well, maybe not uplifting, but at least interesting. What's going on in the Arctic? I saw some stuff in the sources about increased activity up there.
Yeah, the Arctic is becoming a hotspot, so to speak. It's always been strategically important. But with climate change melting the ice, it's opening up new shipping routes and access to all sorts of resources, like oil and gas.
So everyone's trying to get a piece of the action.
Pretty much. Russia's been flexing its muscles up there, building up their military presence, claiming territory. China's been showing more interest too, investing in infrastructure, building icebreakers.
And what about the U.S.? Are we just sitting back and watching this happen?
Not exactly. We've been conducting freedom of navigation operations up there, trying to push back against Russia's claims.
Sounds like things could get tense up there.
They could. It's definitely a region to watch.
Okay, before we move on, any final thoughts on the potential ceasefire between Israel and Hamas?
Well, I'll just say this. I'm cautiously optimistic. It's a long shot, but if both sides are really committed to peace, maybe, just maybe, something good can come out of this.
Here's hoping. Okay, let's talk about the Syrian situation for a minute. Things are still pretty messy over there, aren't they?
Yeah, it's a real powder keg. The HTS is trying to run the country, but they're facing opposition from all sides. Remnants of the Assad regime, Kurdish forces, other rebel groups.
And there are still foreign troops operating in different parts of the country, right?
Yeah, Russians, Americans, Turks. It's a real tangled web.
And any one of those threads could unravel the whole thing, I guess.
Exactly. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and the whole situation could explode.
So no easy answers there, huh?
Nope. It's going to be a long and difficult road to peace in Syria. And Trump's return to the White House just adds another layer of complexity.
Yeah, he's got a history with Syria, doesn't he? The airstrikes, the threats, the whole mission accomplished thing.
Yeah, it's a long story.
Well, let's hope he's learned from his mistakes. Okay, let's move on to something a little closer to home, at least geographically. What about France? They seem to be playing a more assertive role in global affairs lately.
Yeah, France has always been a major player, but they've really stepped up their game in recent years. They've been leading the charge on sanctions against Russia, providing military aid to Ukraine, trying to find a diplomatic solution.
So they're basically taking on a leadership role in Europe.
In a lot of ways, yeah. They see themselves as a counterweight to Germany, which has been criticized for being too cozy with Russia in the past.
Makes sense. Okay, another potential flashpoint we need to talk about. The South China Sea.
Ah, yes. The South China Sea, it's been a source of tension for decades. You've got China claiming practically the whole thing, building artificial islands, militarizing the region.
And everyone else is pushing back, right?
Yeah, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, they're all disputing China's claims. And the U.S. is right in the middle of it, conducting those freedom of navigation operations, trying to keep the sea lanes open.
So basically, it's a giant game of chicken.
Pretty much. Everyone's trying to assert their dominance without actually triggering a war.
How's that going?
So far, so good. But it's a delicate balance, and one wrong move could set things off.
Okay, one last hotspot we got to cover. Iran. The tension between them and the U.S., it just never seems to go away, does it?
Nope. And it's only going to get worse with Trump back in the picture. He's already shown he's willing to tear up agreements, impose sanctions, even threaten military action.
And Iran's not backing down either, are they? They're enriching uranium like crazy, getting closer and closer to developing a nuke.
Right. And that's got Israel really worried. They see a nuclear-armed Iran as an existential threat, and they've made it clear they're willing to take preemptive action to prevent it.
So basically, we're one wrong move away from a major war in the Middle East.
That's always been the case in the Middle East, hasn't it?
Pretty much. All right, let's take a step back and look at the big picture again. What are some of the major trends that are shaping the world today?
Well, one of the most significant is the rise of new powers like China, India, and Brazil. The old world order, dominated by the West, is fading away.
And that's creating a lot of uncertainty, isn't it?
It is. The old rules don't apply anymore, and no one's quite sure what the new rules will be.
So it's a time of both opportunity and danger.
Exactly. New powers are rising, new technologies are emerging, and the global landscape is shifting rapidly.
And the choices we make today will determine what that new landscape looks like.
Absolutely. It's a time for bold leadership, for innovative thinking, for cooperation and collaboration. We need to find ways to build a more peaceful, just, and sustainable world.
Well said. Okay, one last thing I want to touch on. The war in Ukraine. It's been a real wake-up call for the world, hasn't it?
It has. It's shown us that peace is fragile, that aggression can happen anywhere, anytime.
And it's highlighted the importance of standing up for our values, for democracy, for freedom.
Right. And it's shown us the limitations of the international order. The UN, the international courts, they haven't been very effective in stopping this war.
So what does that mean for the future?
It means we need to rethink the way we approach global security. We need to find ways to strengthen international institutions to make them more effective in preventing and resolving conflicts.
Easier said than done, I imagine.
It is. But it's a challenge we have to face.
No.
The world is becoming increasingly interconnected, and the consequences of conflict are becoming more and more severe. We need to find a way to live together peacefully, or we're all going to suffer.
Well, on that cheery note,
I know.
let's move on to something a little less heavy.
Sounds good to me. So we were talking about the global economy. It's not exactly in great shape right now, is it?
Not exactly booming, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Between the war in Ukraine, those energy shortages, inflation going crazy, it's tough out there for everyone.
Yeah, no kidding. A lot of people are wondering if we're headed for a full-blown recession.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's hard to say.
So no easy answers there, huh?
Nope. Too many factors in play. But I can say this, it's a good time to be cautious, make sure you've got some savings tucked away just in case things get even rougher.
Always good advice.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of things that might get rough, artificial intelligence. It's advancing at an insane pace, and it feels like no one really knows what that means for the future.
Yeah. AI is a big one. It's got the potential to change, well, everything. The way we work, the way we live, even the way we fight wars.
And not all those changes are going to be good, I imagine.
Right. One of the biggest concerns is job displacement. As AI gets smarter, it's going to start automating a lot of jobs that are currently done by humans.
And that means a lot of people are going to be out of work.
Yeah, exactly. Which could lead to all sorts of social and economic problems. And then there's the potential for AI to be used for, well, bad stuff. Developing autonomous weapons, creating super realistic propaganda, scary stuff.
It's like something out of a sci-fi movie, except it's actually happening.
Right. So yeah, we got to be careful with this one. We need to figure out some ethical guidelines, some regulations before it's too late.
Okay, let's talk about another trend that's been causing a lot of hand-wringing.
Mm-hmm.
Populism and nationalism. It seems like everywhere you look, people are turning inwards, rejecting globalism, embracing strongman leaders. What's going on here?
It's a complicated phenomenon, but I think it's partly a reaction to globalization. People feel like they've lost control, like their cultures are being eroded, their jobs are disappearing. They're looking for someone to blame, someone to protect them.
And those populist leaders, they're more than happy to provide a scapegoat, right?
Exactly. They offer simple solutions to complex problems. Build a wall, ban Muslims, bring back the good old days. It's all very appealing, especially if you're feeling scared and angry.
But it's dangerous, isn't it?
Extremely. It divides people, undermines democracy, and makes it almost impossible to address global challenges like climate change. It's basically every country for themselves, which is not a recipe for a stable world.
So how do we counter this trend?
That's the big question. Part of it is addressing those underlying economic anxieties,
Yeah.
making sure people feel like they have a fair shot, that their voices are being heard. And part of it is pushing back against those narratives of fear and division, promoting tolerance, understanding, cooperation.
It's a battle for hearts and minds, basically.
It is, and it's not one we can afford to lose.
Okay, let's talk about something a bit more concrete. Terrorism. It feels like we've been fighting this war forever, and it never really ends, does it?
No, it doesn't. And it's constantly evolving. Terrorist groups are getting more sophisticated, using new technologies, finding new ways to recruit and radicalize.
It's a whack-a-mole game, basically. You take down one group, and another pops up somewhere else.
Pretty much. But that doesn't mean we should give up. We need to keep fighting, keep adapting, keep working to understand the root causes of terrorism and to address those grievances.
And we need to be smart about it. right?
Yeah.
We can't just bomb our way out of this problem.
Exactly. We need a multi-pronged approach. Intelligence sharing, law enforcement cooperation, military action where necessary, and a focus on building resilient societies that are less vulnerable to radicalization.
So a whole of society approach, basically.
Right. This isn't just a war for governments to fight, it's a war we all have to fight together.
Well said. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground today, and it's been, well, pretty intense. But before we sign off, any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with? Let me think. Yeah, I guess I'd just say this. The world is a complicated, messy, often scary place, but it's also full of possibility, and it's up to each and every one of us to make it a better place.
So get out there, get involved, make a difference. Exactly. Don't be afraid to speak up, to challenge the status quo, to fight for what you believe in.
Because the future is not something that just happens to us. It's something we create.
Well said. Couldn't have said it better myself.
All right, folks, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive into global affairs.
It's always a pleasure.
Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay curious.